Hey, welcome to my show. My name is Bret, and this channel is all about containers, Docker, Kubernetes, cloud native, the CNCF, all those things, and everything DevOps, if I didn't mention that already. So thanks for being here. If you're here live, that means you get to ask questions for me and my guests during the show, so make sure you throw those into the chat. We'll be here talking about an hour and taking your questions, talking about Logzio and getting some demos in. And that'll be fun. If you are new to this channel and you haven't seen this format before with me, then definitely subscribe and click that little bell like every other YouTube channel tells you to do, because that'll give you indications of when I'm going live. You'll get a little pop-up notification on your phone when we go live, and you can join us every week. I'm usually here live on Thursdays, and then other clips and shows show up throughout the week. And this also turns into a podcast. So if you're not able to watch this whole thing and you want to listen to it on your way to work, you can also do that in the description below. There's a link to the podcast, which is about a month behind this live show. So you'll see those typically show up about a month later. So thanks so much for showing up. Apologies today. I have a little bit of a cold, so sorry about that. But I promise that it will not damper my spirits for anything we're going to be doing today, because on the show today, I have a special guest. I have from Logzio in Boston, I have Justin Quinn here, who is a solutions architect. Thanks for being on the show.
Hey, Bret. Thanks for having me today.
So a little bit about Logzio. So it's they started out years ago as a logging company, and now they do the whole observability, monitoring, basically everything for your containers and more. So we're going to dive into some demos later, so definitely stick around to see some of the demos that Justin's going to show us. It's going to be pretty cool. We've already been talking about them before the show, so I'm excited to see what it's all about. But to begin, let's talk a little bit about you. Like, what's your background? What's your job like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started off, I graduated from school as a computer science major. Then my first job out of school, I was working for Dell SecureWorks. I worked in their security operations center, so doing mainly, security stuff. I moved on from there after about 4.5 years, and then I went even further into security, and I worked for a small MSSP, being basically a trusted advisor for some of our clients there. And then after that, I moved on to Logzio as a solutions architect. So, my day-to-day job is pretty much talking to prospective clients and explaining the value of the product and seeing if Logzio would be a good fit for our prospects.
Cool. So in other words, you're spending a lot of time with customers trying to see their solutions, figure out if all this stuff works. So, what do the clients look like? I mean, is everybody running Kubernetes nowadays? Like, what's your feeling of the marketplace and the kind of typical setups people have? Is it cloud, hybrid? Is it everything?
Yeah, exactly. So, some of the clients we talk to are hybrid. A good majority of companies obviously are moving towards cloud today. With the movement to cloud, with the movement from monolithic applications to microservices, the increased complexity in terms of what's going on with those microservices is tough to see for clients. Yeah. So essentially what we're doing is we're offering a platform for our clients to be able to take a look at logs as well as infrastructure data within their environment.
Yeah, and are these people, are people typically have nothing? Or are they shifting from older solutions, or are they sick and tired of running their own stuff and saying, I want someone else to solve this problem for me?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a little bit of a mix. We do come across prospects that don't have anything in place. They're looking for something to centralize their logs as well as take a look at metrics that are going on in their environment. Other clients come with us with some standard pain. Such as they're running their own ELK stack in their own environment, and the amount of time that they spend maintaining that ELK stack, scaling that ELK stack, doing the parsing of all the different log data can be quite burdensome for them. So, when they come to us, essentially what we're doing is we're offering that as a fully managed solution. So they can use the open source tools they're familiar with, but they don't have the pain of having to do all that that overhead and the back end management of the solutions.
Yeah, I never enjoyed those days where, as a data center manager, I would have to go and ask the storage team for yet again more storage because I have more servers and more logs and more things to track. And it was always, we were just constantly using storage, and it's always a conversation where you never really have a good estimate for what it's going to look like to keep your logs over the course of time as things change and grow. So I've always talked about, you'll all the videos on this channel really are talking about, don't necessarily run logging and monitoring yourself because it's a job and it's not that fun. And so it's much better to just not have to worry about it. And if you can get away with using a third-party solution outsourced, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, like that's always my preference for anybody I'm working with, because it's another. Typically, the team is already full busy, right? Like people don't have 5 hours a week to manage their logging and monitoring solution. So it's enough to keep creating all those new alerts. That's a lot of work to constantly improve the logging and monitoring algorithms and checking for the things, making sure that things that broke in the past that you didn't get alerts on, that you've created new observability into that. And that's usually what I try to get the team focused on, instead of, okay, now we have to increase more storage. Well, now we need another thing over here because it's not scaling correctly in our logging solution and things are slow or whatever. So yeah, I'm excited to get into it, because I think I met, I can't remember who it was, but I saw your booth years ago at, I think, probably a DockerCon, and I love the idea of it being an open source solution that I could use anywhere and I didn't have to manage, but it was familiar to me. It wasn't some custom solution that only worked, with that provider. Obviously, there's lots of solutions out there, but I love the idea that I can go and play with it myself. But then when it's really in production, I don't have to worry about maintaining it myself. I can just let someone else do that. So what sort of things are you doing on top? So assuming someone knows ELK and you walk in the door and they've seen Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana, like they've seen that setup. What sort of things beyond that is Logzio doing?
Yeah, no, great question. So essentially, again, what we're offering is it's pretty much a SaaS solution. So the clients ship the data to us, and then they're able to just use the interface. But on top of the standard vanilla ELK stack, we've added different features on top of that, things to speed up troubleshooting. So things like recognizing patterns in the log messages that are being sent, in order to filter out noise quicker. Things like an alerting engine, so you can set up alerts, have alerts triggered to different endpoints, basically anything that can accept a webhook. And then along with the speeding up troubleshooting, with different features that help with data management. So things like being able to drop certain log messages with drop filters, the ability to archive data to an S3 bucket. And then we also have some machine learning and AI built into the platform as well.
So let me back up a second and make sure that we're all on the same page. So I see a lot of buzzwords around. Obviously, logging and monitoring are pretty common. I think most people understand what those really are about. I definitely want to get a little bit into how containers changed all that for us. So let's earmark that for a discussion in a little bit, because if you're new to containers, sometimes we believe that everything changes, but nothing changes at the same time, right? But when we start talking about some of these buzzwords, I see observability a lot as a term on the internet, but I don't quite understand, is that logging or monitoring, or what does that encompass?
Yeah, so I would say that logging and monitoring are two components of observability. Essentially, what observability is that people need to know what's going on in a system based on the external signals that system's giving off. So, just as an analogy, you could have observability into, an application. You could have observability into a car or even your own body, for example. Perfect example of like an external output would be, if you took your temperature and you have a high temperature, that's an external output basically indicating that you could potentially be sick. Same thing with like a car. So a car overheats, that's a signal that something might be going wrong with the engine. So it's the same thing with an application. we're collecting all the outputs that an application is giving off and basically determining what's going on with that application.
Right. So, what are the requirements to say that you're observing something? What are some of the requirements, and who cares about it? Like, I mean, is this something that's only for the ops team? Who's usually using these kind of tools?
Okay. So in terms of how to achieve observability, I would say um, observability. You mentioned logging and monitoring. I would say those are the first two components of observability. I would say the third one would be tracing, but just to focus on the logging and monitoring first. So um, logging would be coming from your containers, so you can have your Docker containers send logs to something like an ELK stack. And the thing with logging, you can use the logs for troubleshooting. Most of the data is coming in unstructured. It's easy to collect, but sometimes it might be overwhelming with the
Right.
number of logs that are being given off
Sure.
from a container. Um, so that's kind of where the metrics and the monitoring portion comes in. So collecting metrics, things like system metrics, like CPU, memory usage, disk space, things like that, as well as custom metrics that could come directly from your application. Things like web page hits, logins to the app. That information it will allow you to take a look at the health over a certain period of time. And then what you can do is view graphs of those metrics to see if there's any anomalies going on. But the thing with metrics is that they don't give context as to what's the root cause. So, you have a spike in CPU, but you don't know what's causing that spike. And then that's where you would go and turn to the log messages to basically see what's causing that spike in CPU or memory, something like that. Um, and then tracing, once your application is working from, a health standpoint, tracing is more geared around performance. So traces can show you where the bottlenecks are happening within your application.
And I see the term APM. Is that related to tracing? What's that about?
Correct. Yep. So that's application performance monitoring. And again, those two terms are used synonymously. And again, it's just basically identifying the bottlenecks.
Yeah. All right. So if I'm new to containers, and maybe I'm not new to containers, but I'm certainly new to clusters of servers with dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of containers. Um, One of the big challenges with everyone, even if they have some sort of Kubernetes distro or they're just using vanilla Docker, is okay. What do I do with all these logs? They're all filling up my Docker host, right? Docker by default doesn't stop the logs from growing. So usually one of my tips in a Docker intro course is usually about changing the defaults when you set up your containers to limit the number of logs, limit it to like 10 meg or something, so that you don't end up like I did years and years ago, filling up the hard drive of a production host and then finding everything dies because your logs never got cut off. So with the challenges of understanding logging in containers, can you sort of walk me through that evolution of like, okay, I got containers, now what? Okay, now I have orchestration, now what?
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, with container logging, obviously you can log everything, but when you're logging every single thing, things become too verbose. It takes 10 times longer to figure out the root cause of something if you're going through millions and millions of log messages. I mean, with Docker containers specifically, what we typically recommend is sending logs to a file path, and then we typically run a container side by side that runs something like FileBeat. So then FileBeat can read from that file path and forward the logs over to a modern platform like ELK.
Right. So if I was running one Docker server to keep it simple, am I running, in your case, running FileBeat per container, almost like in a sidecar pattern, or is it one per host, or how's that work?
It would be like a sidecar pattern.
Okay. So, so all that we're talking about so far is really open source, right? Like FileBeat's open source, the ELK solution technically is open source. At least all the stuff that we all know today. So once I go to orchestration, how does that change? I mean, obviously orchestration itself is more complicated, but what does logging do when I'm on a Kubernetes cluster? Is that anything different than Docker?
So for Kubernetes, typically it's a pretty similar setup in terms of a logging standpoint. Same thing, we would run typically like a daemon set. And what we usually recommend for Kubernetes is using something like Fluentd as a daemon set. And it's doing, something pretty similar to what I talked about with FileBeat and the Docker container, forwarding logs to the open source ELK stack that way, basically.
All right. And when if we go back to Docker for a second, because this I think is a source of confusion, especially for new people, is that we have more. I mean, obviously we have. When you run a container, there's a log for it. But what other things? I mean, are we talking about daemon logs? I know there's Docker has like a metrics endpoint optionally, like stuff like that. What are all the things that are just in Docker alone that I need to worry about?
Yeah, no, great question. So I mean, some of the more important things are things like metrics. So seeing, in terms of how many containers are running, tracking things like the CPU, memory usage, or disk space. I think those are the most important things, just to see if, there's anything wrong with any of the containers that are running in the environment. But I would say those are probably the most important things to track from a metric standpoint.
Yeah, and so when you say metrics in Docker, are you specifically talking about that optional metrics endpoint that a lot of people still don't know about, or something else?
So are you asking in terms of how to collect the metrics,
Right.
or?
Yeah, like in other words, people say metrics, but there's host metrics, there's metrics inside the Docker endpoint, like the um, what is it, the Prometheus standard or whatever. So I know there's multiple levels there, but I was just curious which ones you track and all that.
Yeah, so it's kind of up to what our clients want to take a look at. What we use to collect the metrics is something called Metric Beat. And same thing, it's running pretty much as a side container. But what Metric Beat has is they have different modules that you can enable. And you can enable, like, they have a Docker module as well as like a system metrics module that you can enable, and take a look at, the different types of metrics that are offered from those modules.
All right. And then as I get to Kubernetes, I'm assuming that some of this is it talking to the kubelet or like to the Kubernetes API at all? Is there any sort of intelligence with Kubernetes?
So in regards to what respect?
Oh, well, and if I were to take a Kubernetes cluster and I'm going to throw it into Logzio, is it using stuff inside of Kubernetes, the actual, like I said, the API or the kubelet, or is it just looking specifically for those log files, and then the rest of it is really just metrics out of the host and like container D or whatever your runtime is?
Yeah, so it would be the latter. It'd be looking directly for the log files and the metrics that are being output from either Fluentd or Metric B.
Cool. Well, how does it? And maybe this will be something that could be for us to talk about in the demo. Like, it's always challenging for me, like identifying. Okay, I have this deployment, or I have this, this daemon set, and identifying that in my logging monitoring solution to all of the replicas and things that are going to that. How does that all sort of connect inside of your solution?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's important when it comes to like parsing data. So as that data comes in, we're able to parse key value pairs out of the data. So then you're able to search for, specific namespaces, or for specific container IDs that are included in those log messages. And then you're able to go through and, search on that data once the key value pairs are parsed out. You can create dashboards, visualizations, things like that, from those key value pairs.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, so with Kibana, we have a question in the chat about what about swarm logging, and one of the things that I was going to mention Tell me if I'm wrong. Well, since Swarm is using all the same features it's built into Docker, so it's using the same Docker metrics, the same Docker, um, logs for the containers, the daemon logs, the host. Those are all the same. They don't change for Swarm. So if someone wants to go look at specific metadata related to Swarm, like I think there's metadata in there that identifies like the container and which service it's connected to and which stack that's connected to. That's all in there. Can you take your own Kibana dashboards and sort of upload them to Logzio? How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a perfect example, a lot of prospects that come to us are running their own ELK stack in their environment. So they might already have, numerous different dashboards that they've created. So when they pivot over to use a solution, something like Logzio, they're able to export those dashboards and then import them into our solution. That way they don't have to go through and create, all the different dashboards that they already have.
Right. That's pretty cool because there's not a there's really you can't really do that with any proprietary solution out there. Really, the only way you can do this is with something like open source, where you're having it on-prem, and then you can. The other thing here is that related to this question about swarm logging, there is a great repo from Stefan that is called Swarm Prom. I'm going to throw this into the chat. Swarm Prom, SWARMPROM, and it's for Prometheus. But one of the things it can do is there are templates in there. So if you're going to look at something like ELK and Kibana, what you want to do is you want to look around, and I don't have a hot link right off the top of my head, but there's probably dashboards already created just for that for Swarm, and those are a great way to start. Typically, like when I'm looking at a custom solution, like something might be for Swarm, I don't go and hand create all of that data for the visualizations. I usually try to find someone, and there's almost always a GitHub repo with someone who has templates that I can just plug and play. And it's pretty neat that because you're so open source based, I can go grab these things and upload them, and it will work with the metadata because it's all the same metadata coming out of the systems. So for the person asking that question, maybe go check that out. Look up some Kibana Swarm templates and see if you can't find that.
Yeah, agreed. And Bret, just to add in there too. So, I mean, that's one of the great things about open source, obviously, is the community behind it. There's many different dashboards for different platforms that you can find out there in the community. And then we've included that community kind of into our product as well. So if one of our clients has a dashboard that they've created for their Docker containers or for their Kubernetes environment or for Docker Swarm, they're able to contribute that template for the dashboard or visualization that they created, so that some of our other clients would be able to utilize those.
Yeah. So I know we've got some demos, and I'm anxious to get to some of that sweet screen sharing. so what do you got for us?
Yeah, so let me go ahead. I can share my screen here. Just give me one moment. Okay, so you should be able to see a Kibana dashboard now.
Yep.
Yep. So I mean, in terms of the first product that we developed as a company was the log management solution based on ELK. So we're offering this as a fully managed solution. So the only thing our clients are in charge of is shipping the data to us. And then they're able to use the platform to, do their monitoring, their troubleshooting, and take a look pretty much to see what's going on in their environment. Typically, where I recommend that our clients start off is at the Send Your Data tab. So if I go to Send Your Data here, this outlines all the different ways that you can get data into the platform. I know we've already touched on some of the open source shippers, things like FileBeat, as well as FluentD. But then we do have direct integrations as well. So if we go down to like our Docker logging, we have GitHub repos that basically walk you through how to pull logs and metrics from both Docker as well as Kubernetes. So the instructions are right here, and then I have the the GitHub repos right here on another tab. So again, for Docker, you would just run filebeat basically in a separate container. For metrics for Docker, again, that's going to be the same setup, but you're going to be using metric beat basically as a sidecar as well. And then for Kubernetes-based environments, we typically recommend a daemon set using FluentD. But yeah, and with the integrations with both Docker and Kubernetes, you're able to get the logs and metrics in that way. And then for cloud-based environments as well, we have integrations with AWS, Azure, as well as GCP, so all the major cloud providers. In terms of some of the features that we've added on to ELK, so again, we've covered some of the features that we've added to speed up troubleshooting, so things like alerting. So again, you can basically configure an alert. An alert would be based off a query. So once you have that query built, you could either do it with something like the Apache Lucene language that's supported with ELK, or you can just add filters, based on the drop down that I've selected here. But once your query's built, you can then select create an alert. So then this will bring you to the alert creation page. You can define the alert. You can set a trigger. So when the number of logs in the last 5 minutes is greater than 0, we'll cut a medium severity alert. You can add a tiered alerting system as well. And then the final important piece is, where is that alert going to be sent? So we have a lot of customers that send alerts to things like Slack channels, Microsoft Teams, things like PagerDuty. And again, anything that can accept a webhook, we can send an alert to as well. Again, if we highlight some of the troubleshooting features that we have, so we have something called patterns. So if I go to patterns here, essentially what patterns is doing is it's grouping these log messages in smaller subsets so that it's easier to go through and speed up that troubleshooting process. So as an example here, you can see we're looking at data over the last 24 hours, and you can see over the last 24 hours, we have over 1 million log messages. So, if you're troubleshooting some type of issue, it's not really reasonable to go through and take a look at each one of those log messages. So what I typically recommend is going to something like patterns. And the patterns here is what they're doing is they're identifying any patterns that are made up in your log messages. So as an example, if you're taking a look at like this first pattern, this proxy request to services send, you can see that this particular pattern is included in almost 18% of the logs that we're looking at. So if this isn't relevant to what you're troubleshooting, what you could do is you could create a negative filter for that pattern. So you'll see when I add that negative filter, the negative filter is added to the filter bar. And then again, you can go through and keep going on with this exercise, in terms of eliminating patterns that aren't relevant to what you're troubleshooting. But let's say, you did find a pattern that was relevant to what you were troubleshooting. So something like maybe this SSL library error. So if you wanted to take a look at the log messages that match that specific pattern, you would simply just add a positive filter for that pattern. And then when you do that, you'll be brought from the patterns tab directly to the log messages that match that specific pattern. So then from here, you're able to expand the log message and pretty much just dig into what's going on with this log message. One thing that this specific log message triggered is geared towards our AI and machine learning component. So if I go to the insights here, this triggered what we call a cognitive insight. And essentially what we're doing with cognitive insights is we're crowdsourcing the engineering community. So we're taking a look at sites like Stack Overflow, like you can see here, GitHub, the SANS Institute, and we're pretty much just trying to, we're pretty much identifying any issues that are coming up in the community and then we're comparing that with the information that our clients are sending us. So the whole idea behind it is more proactive troubleshooting in terms of trying to identify any operational or security issues that might be going on in a client's environment that they might not necessarily be aware of.
All right.
And with these cognitive insights that trigger, if the insight's important in the client's environment, they can go ahead and create an alert on that. Again, send that alert to Slack, PagerDuty, anything like that. If the insight's related to maybe some type of bug in their environment, they might have like a Jira link open, so they could edit the insight. They could put that Jira link in there. That way, if someone else comes across that insight, they don't have to waste time troubleshooting the issue. They'll know right away that it's related to that Jira bug that they already have a case open for. So with the insights as well, we actually have an insights tab. So I can go over to our insights tab here. And I know I've covered the cognitive insights, but the other type of insights that we have is called application insights. And essentially with application insights, what they're doing is they're identifying any new errors or exceptions that are being thrown from your application logs. And then with both application and cognitive insights, you're able to then plot those insights on the graph that you can see here. And then you can correlate those insights with any of your CI/CD processes. So as an example, if we were ingesting something like Jenkins logs, you'd be able to plot a marker. So if we go over to markers here, you can create a marker. And then when you're sending your Jenkins logs into the platform, any type of update done in Jenkins will then log that event. And then that CI/CD process will be tracked with these gray squares that you can see. And again, those are called markers. So, as a perfect example, if there was an application insight that triggered for some type of error or exception, and you had a marker for a recent code release, you'd be able to pretty much look at this graph and be able to correlate those two events together. And the same thing goes for the cognitive insights. If there was a cognitive insight for some type of connection issue to a server, and you had a marker in place that indicated maybe like an update to a certificate, again, you'd be able to plot that information and then go back and take a look at the graph and correlate those events together.
Yeah. And this part, the screen, the insights you're showing here, that's not something that's built into Kibana natively, right?
Correct. Yeah. This is something that Logzio has added into the platform. Same thing with the alerting that I talked about, as well as the patterns feature.
Yeah, because alerting, I think one of the confusing things when people first start to set up a lot of these solutions, that alerting is typically not something that works out of the box. You usually need some other tool and a bunch of configuration and all that stuff to get it working.
Correct. Yeah. And then some of like the data management things that we've added into the ELK stack. So an example would be something like drop filters. So if you go to the cogwheel, you can go to tools and then you would go over to drop filters here. So what I recommend using the drop filters for is typically for log messages that you don't need at all times, but you might need, at some point. So a perfect example is something like debug level logs. Obviously debug level logs are very verbose. So if we're ingesting those at all times, that's going to add to the cost of our solution. But if you created something like a drop filter here, you can see an example looking for log type. For this example, it's my secret app, and then the level being debug. So you could have this drop filter toggled on. So all those debug logs will be dropped. And then let's say all of a sudden you have some type of issue in your environment and you need those debug level logs. You can toggle this filter off and those logs will start flowing into the platform so that you can then go through and troubleshoot your issue.
Right. I don't think I've ever deployed a production solution that not use something like drop filters, because that there's always a a bunch of stuff that you don't want. And I love the idea that you can toggle these on and off, um, because you maybe don't want them most of the time, but you want sort of a, oh no, things aren't going well, let's turn on all the logging. And the last thing we all want to do, right, is to go uh, changing settings on our servers to get more verbose logs out of them. And usually you can't easily do that across a bunch of servers. So having it at this level where someone can change it in the monitoring and logging solution rather than touching the host and turning on stuff like debug or like the response stuff for access logs and stuff like that. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's obviously other ways around dropping logs that aren't needed. As an example, you could do it in the file beat or fluentd configuration files. But again, that's why I usually recommend to use the drop filters when it's logs that you might need at some point.
Yeah. We have a question in chat around, I think it was related to when you were talking about insights and maybe some of the initial stuff before insights. The question is around identifying the patterns, or who identifies the patterns, and they're just trying to understand if there's some type of AI behind that can help identify common patterns.
Yeah, so I believe from that question that they're referencing the patterns tab here.
Yeah.
So these patterns are being defined by Logzio. So when you start shipping the data to us, we're basically using some type of, it's basically regex, taking a look at, it's matching on like a regex pattern, and then categorizing those patterns into constants and variables. So the constants are highlighted in black, and then you can see the variables that are highlighted in orange here. So again, our clients don't have to define these patterns themselves. This is all being done on the back end by Logzio.
Cool. All right, so we've been looking at logging for a while. Is the dashboard for metrics different? Is it using a totally different solution there?
Yeah, absolutely. So our metric solution is based on Grafana here. So I actually had, if I bring up our dashboards that we have. So
I have a quick question first. Is what, and I'm not always clear on the difference between Kibana dashboards and Grafana dashboards, because I've always just assumed that Grafana was for metrics and Kibana was for logs. But is that always true? Are they uniquely like that?
Yeah, so that's a question that comes up all the time. So you can 100% use Kibana to visualize metrics data. But with using Kibana for metrics, there are some limitations because it was something that was developed for logging. With metrics and Grafana, Grafana was designed specifically to look at time series data. So you'll see when I show you in just a moment here, when you see the visualizations for Grafana, there's just a lot more that you can do in terms of maybe having like multiple legends, being able to take a look at like negative values with your metrics. Overall, it's just a better user experience when you're using Grafana to visualize your metrics data.
Yeah, okay. Please continue.
Yeah, but I mean, by all means, you can definitely use metrics with Kibana. So again, our infrastructure monitoring or metric solution is based on Grafana, and essentially it solves two pain points. So some of the prospects that we talk to, once you get to a certain point and you're using backends like Prometheus or something like Graphite, once you get to a certain point with the amount of data that you're ingesting, those backends become quite burdensome to scale and to manage. So what we're able to do is we're able to take off basically that we're able to take off that issue in terms of managing and scaling that back end. That way that you can just ship the metrics to us, and then you can just use the Grafana visualizations to take a look at the data that's coming in from your environment. So I can scroll down here, and these are, when you go into metrics, these are just some of the out-of-the-box dashboards that we have. You can see a bunch for different AWS environments, for Docker, Kubernetes. So we could take a look at something like this Kubernetes cluster here. And again, you can see all the different metrics that we're ingesting from this Kubernetes cluster. So things like the number of containers running, you can see the number of running pods. But then when we scroll down here, so if I scroll down just a little more, you can see two panels that are tracking pod CPU usage as well as pod memory usage. So one of the things with clients that are using something like their own version of Grafana, as well as maybe their own ELK stack on-prem, is that you have pretty much two siloed tools at that point. So if you detect some issue in Grafana with the metrics that you're ingesting, in order to find what's causing that issue, you would then have to go over to Kibana, and you would have to craft a query basically looking for the logs that match the issue that you saw within Grafana. So that would be kind of the second value add that we have. So not only not having to manage the back end, but we've built in a correlation from the metrics to the logs. So as you can see with the two visualizations we're taking a look at right now, you can see starting at just before 8:30, it looks like, you can see that there starts to be a spike in both memory and CPU usage for this Nginx container here. So I can click on this Nginx container just to filter it out. And then, it's a lot easier to see once I filter out the spike that happened. So again, I understand that there's potentially some type of health issue with that container or pod, but I don't know what's causing that. So what you can do is you can come over here and you can explore that in Kibana. So when I click on Explore in Kibana, essentially what that's going to do is it's going to build a query looking at the time range that we're looking at, as well as looking for that particular Nginx container. So if I go ahead and click Explore in Kibana, again, this will bring me back to the log messages, and you can see right here, you have the query that was built, as well as the time range that carries over from Grafana. And then right here, you can dive into the log messages to see basically what's causing that CPU or memory spike. And then this histogram up top shows basically the correlation between the number of logs that we were ingesting. You can see that it wasn't very many. And then when the CPU and memory spike happened, you can see that the number of logs that we started ingesting spiked as well. So again, you can go through those log messages. I mean, just looking at these, you can see this Java exception here, which ends up being the root cause of that CPU and memory spike. And at the same point, this Java exception that you're seeing here will trigger what we call the application insight that we talked about earlier. So as an example, this is the IO exception. You're able to go into your insights here. You can scroll down and find that particular application insight. That would be this one here. So I could check that off. I could plot that insight. And then if I'm plotting my CI/CD processes with markers, I can then correlate that exception to maybe a recent code release or something like that.
Pretty cool. And then, like you said, that connection between the metrics and the logging, that isn't necessarily there in the open source tools. That's another thing you guys provide.
Correct. Yeah. With the open source tools, they typically tend to be siloed, which ends up increasing the mean time to resolution when you're troubleshooting something.
Yeah. Something that often is underappreciated, I think, is we don't always have access to our servers. So I'm taking you off course here a little bit. I'm seeing that live tail option, and I'm assuming what that is that's me able to look at the logs of a container in real time, and it's sort of like is it a substitute for like kube control logs and Docker logs for seeing the
Yeah,
real-time
so
stuff?
exactly. Yep. So you had the exact right idea on this feature. So again, you're able to select the play button if there's a live stream of logs coming in, and you'll then see all that data coming in right within the console screen that you can see on my screen right now. And then you're able to go through and filter that data as well. I mentioned earlier how when you're sending data to our platform that we're parsing that data with key value pairs. So, you'd be able to add a filter here, and then you could look at, let's say, a specific container, or take a look at, all your Kubernetes logs, something like that.
Yeah, very handy. All right, what else we got to look at?
Um, so I think one of the other important features that we have is our archive and restore feature. So coming over here, we can go to, give me just one second here. We can go to our tools and our archive and restore. So with the log management solution that we offer, we have two levers for our pricing. So our pricing is based off the number of gigabytes that we ingest on a daily basis, as well as the retention period of that data. So obviously, with increased retention periods, the solution is going to be more expensive. Most of the clients that we work with have retention periods anywhere from 7 days to 30 days. But that's kind of where archive and restore benefits our clients, because what they're able to do is they're able to archive data to their own S3 bucket. That way they have that data in that bucket, and then they can use that data for whatever they want. And again, it helps meet some of maybe the compliance that our customers have to abide by, especially from like a security standpoint.
Hmm. That's pretty neat.
Yep. And then with the restore option, so a client's able to, once archiving is turned on, they're able to then restore up to 24 hours worth of data within the application. If they need to restore greater than 24 hours worth of data, they would just engage our support team. Our support team is available through an in-app chat support icon, which our users see at the bottom right. And again, they can help with restoring greater than 24 hours worth of data. They also assist with creating dashboards, visualizations. And I think the most beneficial thing that they provide is what we call parsing as a service. That's beneficial for clients that are sending things like custom application logs. So with custom application logs, that data might not be parsed out of the box.
Yeah.
Going through and writing your own parsers can take quite a bit of time. So our clients, if they give our support team like a sample of the logs that are being sent, as well as what they want parsed out of those logs, our support team is able to go through and write the grok filters that parses that data out.
Yeah. Do you recommend JSON normally, or?
Yeah, typically that's the recommended format is to send the logs in JSON. And if it's a standard log type, things like Apache Access logs, Nginx logs, anything like that, that data is typically parsed automatically. The parsing as a service is more geared towards custom application logs,
Yeah.
or anything that might not necessarily be parsed out.
Right, that custom Java program from 20 years ago that someone architected their own bespoke logging solution. We dealt with plenty of those, yeah. Um, so, all right, so when we start talking about the open source part of this, you mentioned APM and the larger observability. So I know these are parts of it, but then you mentioned the introspection into the apps themselves. What's that all about in the app interface?
Yeah, so are you talking about like the application performance monitoring
Yeah.
piece? Yeah, so That's something that we're currently developing. We're basing the APM solution on Jaeger. As you can see, you probably see that tab right here. This isn't something that's fully rolled out into production yet. It's still something that, again, that we're developing. Based on the feedback that I've gotten from my product team, it should be something that would be available in Q2 at some point. So again, with application performance monitoring, the whole idea behind it is basically seeing the performance of your application and seeing where the bottlenecks are happening within that application, so that you can then go through and fix whatever's broken.
And if I'm not mistaken, Jaeger is a graduated CNCF project, right? So it's kind of like becoming one of the standards for how you do tracing inside the cloud native ecosystem.
Correct. Yeah, and I know Jaeger was developed by, I believe it was by two Uber engineers.
Hmm.
So yeah, but it's definitely, I would say, in terms of open source tracing, I would say it's becoming the industry standard.
Yeah. Do you know? Because I've never actually got to use Jaeger yet. Do you know if is it something that you need to add in to your custom apps, or is it something that can be sort of plugged in after the fact? How exactly is it doing this tracing?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, and again, I'm by no means an expert with Jaeger at this point, but as far as I'm aware, you have to instrument it into your code
Yeah.
in order to be able to track those traces.
Yeah, because I mean, historically, the first part was getting it into your apps, which isn't always easy, right? Especially if it's going to be ability to turn on in production kind of thing. And then the second challenge is always seeing the data and understanding it. And I love that the CNCF has tons of projects, but the fact that this distributed tracing has gotten so much more attention in the last couple of years as these projects have matured, and the CNCF is backing them with people in marketing and stuff like that. It's going to be nice to be able to kind of have a couple of these stacks like this where we can just say, yes, you don't go. There's maybe 50 tools to choose from, but if you want it to all work well with, a Java app or a Node.js app or whatever, and it's on Kubernetes, and you're using ELK, and you're using all these because we're getting into the standards or the monitoring formats and all that stuff. I like that we have a clearer path for how to choose these tools, because I think a lot of times my customers come to me and they're always very confused about the plethora of choices, and they don't quite understand that they could very easily end up with a monitoring solution, a logging solution, and a tracing solution, and none of them know about each other, and there's no cohesion between any of these things, and they're all separate. And I think that's so common that it ends up being one of those things where you do it all, and then you realize, oh, I'm cutting and pasting a lot of things from one screen to another, and I really wish that these things had more integration. So I'm sure that adding that in there will be pretty good for insights.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And with everything kind of being based on speed of deployment, speed of, keeping up with the market, I think having those tools be able to talk to each other to obviously decrease the time to resolution when any issues pop up, I think is crucial kind of moving forward.
Yeah. So is there, okay, so besides tracing, is there anything else you all are working on that you can talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see in the top left under the Logzio icon, what I've shown you is the operations platform. We believe that there's a fourth pillar to observability, and that's security. And again, this is something that's near and dear to my
That's
heart.
right. This is your background, so I was waiting
Yeah,
for you to mention that.
just based on my background. So yeah, so with everything moving to the cloud nowadays with microservices, it's important, to build security into those applications. So that was, this is another one of our products that we've added into the solution. You have clients that use something like ELK for an operations platform, and then they might be, sending that same data to some type of SIM platform. So they're essentially paying to send that data. They're sending that data to two different places. So that data is already being ingested into our operations platform. So what we're able to do is we're able to enrich that data with things like threat intelligence feeds both open source threat intelligence feeds as well as paid ones, things like VirusTotal, and then open source ones like Alien Vault OTX. And then we're also enriching that data with out-of-the-box rules for different cloud environments. So, as an example, we have rules for Microsoft Active Directory. We have Audit D rules, rules for like AWS CloudTrail, Guard Duty, things like that. And within the platform here, you can see right now I'm in the summary page. And this is basically just giving an overview of what's gone on within the last 24 hours. So you can see all the different types of events that have occurred. All the IPs that you're sending, we're able to geotag them. So you can see basically where the traffic's coming from in your environment. As an example, if there's traffic coming from Europe or Africa and you don't have any business with Europe or Africa, you'll know to then go back and maybe block that IP address. The summary of events visualization that you can see here, these are just some of the out-of-the-box rules that have triggered. Again, you can see all the different types of rules that we have. And then at the same time, we've built in dashboards as well. So as an example, if you were taking a look at something like what's been going on with like your EC2 instances, you'd have a dashboard that is pretty much a standard Kibana dashboard. So these are interactive. You can filter out different users, different actions. You can also create a report on a dashboard that might be sent, something like, you could have a snapshot of the summary dashboard that I was just showing. And you could have that be sent at like 8 a.m. every morning just to get, an overview in terms of what's going on from a security standpoint.
Cool.
Yeah.
We do have a question from chat that I missed a little bit ago. It was said, would you explain how you did the build? Would you explain how you built the correlation metric and log messages?
Oh, okay. Yeah, absolutely. So if I go back into operations here, so going back to the metrics. So essentially what we're using for the back end is Elasticsearch. Obviously, we're using that with the logging with ELK,
Right.
but we're also using Elasticsearch as the back end for Grafana. So that kind of brings up another difference between Kibana and Grafana. Kibana is, it strictly uses Elasticsearch as the back end, whereas Grafana can use a number of different time series databases. So it could use, Prometheus, Graphite, InfluxDB, but we're using Elasticsearch, so all that data is basically coming into one place. So that's how we're able to then build in that correlation.
Yeah.
In terms of the intricacies in how we build that correlation, that might be a question that might be a little bit more geared towards some of our developers here. But that's essentially at a high level how we built that correlation into the platform.
Yeah.
By using Elasticsearch.
That's nice. You don't have to run two different database infrastructures for that. Yeah. So when you start talking about, I thought of a question that I'm not sure if you've mentioned. I might have missed it. But on the metrics side, we've got all these health checks now, right? In Docker and in Kubernetes. Are those tracked in the dashboards? Are that value that's added into the experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So those would be things that we'd be able to ingest through metric beat modules. So that would be something that could be that would be included in like the Docker module for metric beat.
Okay. Yeah, because it's one of those things that whenever I walk into a shop and we start talking about operations, one of the first things I go check is, do they have health checks and readiness checks, liveness checks, all that stuff? Because quite often they're not. They're not that hard most of the time, and there's usually examples on the internet for whatever app you're running, unless it's a custom app. So I'm always sort of beating that drum of health checks. I'm like Yeah, the old Microsoft video of developers. I'm like that guy saying health checks, health check. So, um, what else on the security side is that? Does that connect at all to the other parts? Do we see any sort of crossover between those dashboards, or?
So yeah, I mean, you can definitely, I mean, all the dashboards are, they're all built off those key value pairs that I mentioned earlier. So as an example, when I go to dashboards and then take a look at like um, that EC2 one that I was taking a look at, um, you know, these dashboards in the security product are obviously all dashboards for security type data.
Yeah.
That's typically what we recommend using the security platform for, is just using strictly the security dashboards. And then from the operation standpoint, that would be more operational based
Right.
visualizations and dashboards, things like looking at maybe, like 400 errors or things like that.
Um, what's the security tool in the CNCF that does it checks for patterns on the host? It's escaping me right now. I think.
I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head.
Yeah, the Falco might be Falco.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
I was just curious because I know that's when we're talking about the security dashboard. I know that Falco is a tool that runs on the host or in a container, and it looks for things like, oh, someone just execed into a container, or someone changed a file that shouldn't be changed on the host and stuff like that. It has built-in stuff. It's a part of the CNCF, and I was curious if that. I mean, obviously, if it's logs, it's dumping out to, which I believe it is. I'm sure you can pull it in to the logging system, but I didn't know if you had anything pre-built for that.
Yeah, and the intelligence in the security product is something that we're building out. Obviously, with the AI and machine learning stuff, that stuff's pretty complicated. But it's important to get it right. So that's what we're going through and developing at this point.
Yeah.
As well as we're looking to integrate with Demisto as well. Not sure if you're familiar with Demisto, but that's
I'm not.
Demisto is essentially some type of it's a SOAR platform, so security, orchestration, automation, and remediation. So what it's able to do is it's able to basically take action on certain events that happens. And again, that's important. Just going back to, I know I've mentioned it a few times, but like mean time to resolution. So not having to manually go through every security alert that triggers, but being able to basically create a playbook and take an action on that alert when that specific alert triggers as well.
Right, for sure. We have a question in chat. What is the rules tab? Do we build our own rules for security?
Yeah, so great question here. So I can go to the rules tab, and these are the out of the box rules that I had mentioned. So just scrolling down here, you can see out of the box we have 331 rules right now, and that's growing as well.
Yeah.
If for some reason we don't have rules for some of the devices that you're sending logs from, we're able to work with you and take a look at those logs and then create security-based rules off those log messages. Not only is that going to benefit that client, but we're able to add those rules to our rule set, and then it benefits the rest of our clients as well as us.
Yeah, I see the fail to ban stuff there. That's good. I'm a big fan of that.
Yeah, these are one of the new ones. The fail to ban are one of the new ones that we've added in. And again, you can add your own rules. You're able to update the thresholds on the rules. So if a rule is triggering too often, you can increase the threshold so that it doesn't trigger as often. And then if there's a rule that isn't relevant to what you're doing, same thing, similar to what I showed you with the drop filters, you can toggle that rule off as well.
Yeah. Very cool. All right. Do you have any integrations with Istio and other service mesh solutions?
So I guess my question would be in terms of ingesting logs and metrics. We don't have any direct integrations with those service mesh solutions. as far as I'm aware. Istio we might have a direct integration with, but um, you know, we'd be able to ingest logs either through, you could ship logs via HTTPS. You could use an open source shipper, um, basically anything like that. There's usually no issues in terms of ingesting data into the platform. Um, but yeah, that's pretty much how we would get the data in.
Yeah, yeah. Because while you're talking, I'm googling your site, and there is a blog post, multiple blog posts on Istio, but one from last year talks about logging Istio with ELK and Logzio. My bad habits from years ago, calling it the wrong name. So yeah, I mean, obviously, having dashboards and different things specific to that are beneficial. And again, because I feel like I'm selling your product, but with the Grafana dashboard specifically, like there's going to be almost every open source, especially like a CNCF project. There's probably going to be templates out there that you can add to this that will be a lot faster in adding any of these open source tools in there. But that's a great question to see if it's built in or not, because I know a lot of people, once you add the service mesh in, there's so much more complexity that trying to understand all that can be pretty challenging when you have all these new containers and tons of logs that you didn't have before. So yeah, a common topic on this show is, what do I do about service mesh?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we've had a lot of great questions and quite a few demos. So I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for being here. What should people do? Okay, so a couple of questions. One, I'm assuming people go to the website to sign up, right? Is there like a free trial or something?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can go to our website. Our website is logs.io, so logz.io. And right on the homepage of the website, you're able to create a free account. So you just put your email address in, select create account. That will send you an email. You'll be able to choose what region you want to be deployed on. And we're hosted on both AWS and Azure. So there's different regions throughout the world that we can host on from both platforms. And then that will drop you into a trial. So the trial will last for 2 weeks. And the trial will allow you to send 5 gigabytes of data a day, as well as retain that data for 4 days. And then if you want to ship metrics, it's the same thing. You can set up metric beat, ship those metrics. We don't really have a cap on that right now.
Yeah.
But then after that trial expires, you'll then dropped into a community plan. The community plan's free, and it allows you to ship 3 gigabytes worth of data a day and retain that data for 3 days.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I know, like, especially for hobbyists, and we've got a lot of what I call solo DevOps people on the channel that have small environments, small setups, but they want to do things. They want to modernize their infrastructure, even though they have only a few servers and not a lot of complexity. So being able to use these solutions with a low cost or free plan is always a pretty cool thing, especially when you're talking about dev, right? Dev and test, where you just maybe need today's logs, and it's not that big of an infrastructure. That's pretty cool too. So cool. Thanks for that. Where can people find you or Logs.io on the web? Besides the website, like are you on social? Yeah. What's all that?
Yeah, exactly. So you can follow our Twitter account. Our Twitter account, which you can probably see on the screen right now, is @Logzio. And then within our website as well, we have a blog as well as different resources that have links to webinars and things like that. So we're constantly pushing out blogs relating to DevOps, as well as webinars, geared around Grafana and Kibana typically.
Yeah, very cool. Well, thanks a lot for being on the show, Justin. I learned a lot. I'm excited to finally learn about your platform, because I've known about it for years, and I've wanted to take a look, and now you gave me the excuse to go take a look, because I know I can get a limited little plan for my few servers running a website, and it's great. So in case you didn't get all that information at the beginning, to find out what we're going to be doing next week, just subscribe to this channel. And then we're also on Patreon, so you can support this chat, because Logzio didn't pay me to do this. So this is how I, to recoup the little bit of time I spend on this. Go ahead to go to Patreon and become a member. And you get all sorts of exclusive benefits, like showing up on our monthly chit chat where we talk about DevOps stuff. And maybe we'll have Justin back on the show and talk more about logging and monitoring later. So thanks again.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Bret.
All right, you too. See you next week, everyone.